Okay, everyone, we might as well make a start. So this week, what we want to do is explore Émile Durkheim. So we're going to have the whole week looking at Durkheim. Now, obviously, as most of you probably know, Émile Durkheim is considered one of the forefathers of sociology. So any reason why he is associated as the kind of one of the forefathers? Why is Durkheim perhaps quite important to the discipline of sociology? Any ideas? So obviously, some of the central aspects of Durkheim that we're going to discuss throughout the week is that he obviously saw in sociology a distinct way of studying society. So in essence, he wanted to establish and formulate a distinct discipline that had its own particular methods for studying society and understanding society. So inevitably, his contribution is quite immense because it influences sociology at the methodological level as well as the kind of conceptual level of how we conceive of society and social interactions. So clearly he's going to be a key figure. Now let's start first by this statement from Durkheim, where he states, society is not a mere collection of individuals, but a reality in itself which exists prior to individuals and which acts upon them. The individual is the product of society. What is he trying to say here? If we're going to try to break down this statement, what is he saying here? So if we reflect on this statement, it's actually quite a significant statement, and it provides a glimpse into Durkheim's perspective, especially when it comes to society, because this is how he views society, this is how he conceptualizes society. So if we understand this statement, then we can better understand his approach to studying society. So let's look at this. Now first he's saying, which is quite an important point, that society is not just a collection of individuals. So if you have society, it's not just the individuals. The individuals are a component of society. You can't have a society without individuals being present, but that does not dictate what constitutes a society, i.e. just individuals. And what he states is that society is a reality in itself. Any idea what he means here? That society is a reality in itself. So what he's trying to say is that if you look at society as a complete system, society is a connected entity. There are individuals, but above the individuals, what you have is these kind of collective kind of social norms, values, and structures. These things have their own characteristics, and importantly, they exist externally from the individual. So often, as we're going to find out, Durkheim refers to these as social facts. So we are going to explain this in subsequent slides. But for now, society, according to this statement of Durkheim, is a collective entity comprising of individuals and the kind of norms, values, and structures that basically influence the individual. They constrain our behavior. They're external to us, i.e. these values, norms are independent of the human being, but they influence us. They constrain our behavior. Now, social facts, just for kind of understanding it for now, is basically ways of thinking, ways of acting, ways of feeling, right? So these basically are the social facts. These social facts influence our interactions, influence our behavior on a day-to-day level. So what we need to understand then from this statement is that also what Durkheim is saying is that these social facts that are the collective formation of society existed before the individual. So society basically exists before the individual, right? It precedes the individual, these social facts. So how do these social facts precede us? Well, if we think about it, we were all born into a particular society, right? And as we're born into the society, we are taught and indoctrinated within the norms and the values and the structures of that particular society, right? That socializes us. That basically prepares us to interact, how we interact, what is right, what is wrong, what can I do in certain behaviors that might be, looked as taboo. So basically what we're trying to say here is that social facts precede the individual. Importantly, they are external to the individual. The individual is basically influenced by them, but they do not originate in the individual, right? So if you think about, let's say, for example, myself, obviously born in London, and I was born into a working class South Asian family. So straight away, my kind of early upbringing is being influenced in terms of norms and values and structures from that. So I've been put into a certain category of working class or from a South Asian kind of belonging, which again shapes my values and culture and norms that I was kind of raised with. So these social facts existed separately from me, yeah? I did not create these things. These things basically influence my behavior. And okay, so if we want to look at these then, this whole idea of how he conceptualizes society, the key component is obviously social facts. So a good example of social facts, according to Durkheim, is something like language. For Durkheim, language is a social fact. It's something that preceded us. It's going to exist after we're gone. But also, importantly, we did not create the language that we speak. So I did not obviously create the language that I'm speaking now. I was born into a society where it's basically you're taught this language. And this language shapes us. How I communicate, how I basically behave is influenced by this language. So this language is obviously a social fact. It exists as a shared kind of social fact which across society, it's not created by us, but it directly influences us, how we communicate, how we behave. So social facts are things that basically are physical things that influence how we act, how we behave, how we think even. Another example would be, let's say, the law. The law, or the legal system, however you want to refer to it, is also constituted as a social fact. Yeah? So if we think about it, again, obviously, the legal framework, we're born into it. We did not create it. It exists separate from us. It's not basically created by the individual. It's a collectively created thing that becomes a social fact. Now, if we look at the law governs our behavior. Now, how does the law govern our behavior? So obviously, if I go into a supermarket, what's stopping me from stealing something? Why don't I just take the kind of can of Coke? Yeah? There is something that prevents me from going to the supermarket and stealing, engaging in theft. That is the law. Now, I did not create it. I'm not in control of it, but it influences my behavior because the law functions as a deterrent for us all, collectively in society. So we make that law real because it basically prevents and shapes our behavior. So in essence, what Durkheim is trying to say here is that in essence, society is composed of individuals but is directly influenced by these social facts. They constrain our behavior, how we think, how we feel. So we are going to expand on it and look at it in a bit more detail. So this is why Durkheim says the individual is a product of society. So that means your individual consciousness is superseded by these things. These things have a power over us, and they influence how we think. So sometimes we're thinking that things are going to be in my control, my consciousness, I'm making these decisions and choices, but ultimately, sometimes it's influenced by our social facts. But we'll look into that in a bit more detail. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so moving on, the way we're going to structure these two lectures is essentially we're going to dissect the major works of Émile Durkheim. So we're going to focus on these 4 books in this lecture and the next lecture. So these are the 4 major texts for Durkheim. He wrote other works, but these are the key. So we're just going to give a little summary, and then we'll expand on each text. So the first book that we're going to look at is The Rules of the Sociological Method, written in 1895. Now, this isn't the first book. Division of Labour is the first book, but the way we're going to look at it first is we want to look at the rules of the sociological method. The reason for that is because this is where, in this text, Durkheim argues that sociology really should be this distinct and separate discipline. And he, again, bases this on this issue of social facts. For him, these social facts are things that have actual characteristics. These are physical objects and phenomena that we can measure, that we can empirically study objectively. So in essence, what he's saying is, because these are separate from the individual, we can study them, we can examine them. So the significance of this book, i.e. the rules of the sociological method, is quite significant because obviously it establishes a particular approach or method to studying and understanding society. So for the perspective of sociology or classical social theory, it provides a way to examine and study social phenomena, how people interact, what influences behavior and thinking. So this is all from the kind of sociological method. The other text that we're going to look at is Durkheim's quite seminal piece, Suicide, a study from a kind of sociological perspective. So he wrote this in 1897, and this work is quite seminal because, more importantly, he, through this text, introduces the concept of social integration. Yeah, this idea of social integration. So for Durkheim in this text, what he discovered, which is why it's quite significant, is that before this study, people felt that suicide was a quite private affair. It's something private. It's something that's very much about your individual motive. But Durkheim determined through statistical analysis that actually there was a correlation between rates of suicide and social integration. So what he was trying to say is that your level of integration can influence whether someone commits suicide. So if you have weak integration, what does weak integration mean by any chance? We are going to look at it, by the way, but any ideas what do we mean by weak levels of integration in society?
Not involved with anything that's going on?
Yeah, so basically very minimal connections with society. Perhaps lacking family connections, support systems, connection to community, disengaged from events that occur. So very much on the periphery of society. So you have a weak level of social integration. While someone who has a strong level of integration, meaning has ties, has support system, is connected, is participating, is less likely. So this work is significant because it's studying a very kind of controversial social phenomenon, suicide, from a sociological perspective. The next text is The Division of Labour. So I said this is the first text that he wrote, the major text, which is written in 1893. The Division of Labour is important because, again, here he introduces the concept of social cohesion. This book is really looking at the broader question that we're going to look at as well of how society becomes structured, or how do we maintain social cohesion after a period of rapid change. And the rapid change that he talks about is going from basically a disorganized society, meaning kind of tribal, village-based, to a large organized society. So this transition creates social upheaval. This creates a breakdown of social structure, of relationships. So how do we maintain social cohesion when we experience immense transformation, like things like the Industrial Revolution, things like urbanization? These are rapid changes that affect every facet of society. How do we maintain social cohesion after such immense change? So this, again, is an important text because it tries to kind of understand modern society. And lastly, we're going to be looking at the elementary forms of religious life. So this is again written in 1912, so one of his later texts. Now, in this book, around the 19th, 20th century, there is this kind of interest in something called the sociology of religion, which tries to understand the origin of religion as well as the function of religion. Now, the reason for this is because after the Enlightenment, when we adopted science as our new worldview, many of the social thinkers, philosophers at the time predicted that religion would disappear because we would replace it with science. We wouldn't need a religion because now we're going to base truth on the things that we can test and perceive and observe, science, right? So religion would inevitably disappear. But what happens by the 20th century, we still see religion. Religion is still salient. Religion is still important to people's life. And so, in essence, what this tries to do in the broader context of the sociology of religion is, one, determine what is the earliest expression of religion, meaning why did religion form in its earliest manifestation? So what is the origin of religion? The second question that Durkheim looks at is the function of religion. What role does it play in society? What's its purpose? Why do we still keep it? Why do we not, abandon it? What purpose does it fulfill at the societal level? So these are the texts that we're going to look at, and we're going to dissect each of these in a bit more detail. Are there any questions before we do that? Cool. So the first text that we're going to look at is the rules of the sociological method. Now, Durkheim states in this text that if there is to be a social science, we shall expect it not merely to paraphrase the traditional prejudices of the common man, but to give us a new and different view of them. For the aim of all sciences is to make discoveries, and every discovery more or less disturbs accepted ideas. What's he trying to say here? So the obvious thing, and I kind of mentioned it, a key aspect of this text is to create a conceptual and methodological distinction between sociology and other disciplines. So create the sociology as a distinct discipline, right? So why is this needed is because the way to study society in a complete way requires a distinct method. So let's kind of look at it in a comparative way. So if we look at psychology, what's the kind of purpose or the perspective of psychology? Psychology wants to understand the inner dynamics or the inner workings of the mental processes that influence people's behavior, right? So it's very much inward looking, the mental processes, what motivates someone to do something. So from the individual consciousness perspective. While sociology is looking at the outer social conditions, society as a whole. So if we take, for example, let's say you wanted to do a study, why do some people become suicide bombers, right? So this is your study. From the psychology perspective, they will look at it as, okay, what is the internal motives behind the person that commits the act of suicide bombing? So they're very much looking at the internal processes, the mental processes, and a lot of theorists from that discipline assert that basically suicide bombing is an outcome of some kind of mental illness, usually some form of narcissistic rage that they have, and it's basically a mental imbalance or mental illness that kind of causes it. Now, from a sociological perspective, we would see it differently. So you have the individual, right? This individual, as Durkheim said, is a product of society, which means the social facts, the culture, the norms, the structures would have influenced this person during, for example, their upbringing. So all starting from their birth, they would have been influenced by the norms, the values, the structures of society. That would shape their behavior, their actions. And so in essence, that the social conditions that give rise to the act of suicide bombing needs to be looked at. So I think a couple of weeks ago we looked at the case history of Abu Hanima. So we said the thing that externalized him from British society was when he was 8 years old, he saw his mother abused and racially abused in front of him by someone in British society. That turned him against British society. So that created this kind of turmoil in early life. So in essence, what we're trying to say, the sociologist, when you're looking at why someone becomes a suicide bomber, wants to look at the holistic kind of societal perspective, the conditions that lead to the current. So in essence, it's much more kind of holistic. Okay, so continuing with the sociological method, right? So when we talk about sociology as a distinct discipline, and we just kind of iron out a few other kind of key points, sociology as a distinct discipline for Durkheim was based on adopting a kind of very objective approach to studying social facts. So he said these social facts were very much like social things that could be measured, that could be tested and studied. So they have kind of a physical essence, they have characteristics, so you can study them. However, the way you study them is objectively, instead of it being subjective. So what's the difference here? Well, objective is the way of trying to detach yourself from the thing that you are trying to study. So the object that you are studying, you are detached from it emotionally, and the reason for that is because you don't want to impose your bias upon it and distort the raw data, the facts that you're going to generate. The subjective approach is in essence where you draw on aspects of your experience. So there are some researchers, for example, into, let's say, terrorism, conducted by ex-terrorists. So they've undergone the radicalization process. They joined a terrorist group. They were a terrorist. They left, and then they wrote their kind of, what causes someone to become radicalized. The problem sometimes with that approach is that because you experienced the thing you want to study, the phenomenon that you want to study, that can distort how you basically conduct your research. You're not objective, you have experienced it already. So you're going to basically be aware of that, and that's going to influence your study, and that's going to function as a bias. So for Durkheim, he was much more focused on objectively studying social facts. So this is why very distinct discipline. Also what he did, what he suggested, is he rejected the use of common sense to understand society, to understand social facts. Now why reject common sense? What's wrong with common sense according to Durkheim?
Based on your previous knowledge and experiences.
Yeah, so it's based on bias. It's based on you making certain assumptions that are kind of intuitive, that you think basically is the kind of fact. So in essence, he says, to be objective, you can't assume or based on any kind of intuitive knowledge. It has to be based on fact. It has to be based on statistical data. So common sense is really just going to allow you to kind of be influenced by your own set of perspectives, your own experience, your own biases, etc. So he rejected this. The next issue is Durkheim saw sociology as this new perspective. So science originally emerged as this discipline that wanted to unlock the universe. So it wanted to create discoveries, right? So what the physical natural sciences did, it looked at the physical world and it wanted to unlock the laws and principles that govern the physical world. So science was constantly making discoveries, understanding how the physical universe worked. Things like gravity, which then gave us knowledge about how we can actually interact with the natural world. So what Durkheim wanted to do is take that approach and apply it to the kind of social world. That basically sociologists should be making discoveries of the social world, using kind of empirical and objective methods, try to understand how society works, the social phenomenon, the social facts, and make discoveries, new discoveries that basically provide insight into human understanding. So this is something what, for example, Durkheim did in his study of suicide. People believed, like I said, it was a private act. He discovered that actually it relates to the kind of levels of social integration. So again, it's kind of providing some new knowledge about the social phenomenon of suicide. The other point, the last point, is this idea of methodological rigor. So Durkheim emphasized that if we're going to engage in these studies of the social facts, then it has to be based on methodological rigor. So in essence, two methods obviously. There's the quantitative and there's the qualitative. So in essence, the quantitative is very much statistics based. It's about trying to generate data to make a kind of connection, to understand the patterns and trends, right? While qualitative is a lot more about the meaning behind things. So let's look at an example. Let's say if you're trying to study why, for example, Christianity has declined in modern Britain over the last 30, 40 years, well, the first thing that you have to do is quantitatively prove that there has been decline. So your hypothesis is, has Christianity declined in modern Britain? So you would look, say, for example, at 2001, the let's say, census, to 2021, and we see that there has been a decline in the level of membership, i.e. people identifying themselves as Christian has gone down by about 30%. So that shows quantitatively that we've proven from statistics that there has been a change in the trend. Membership in Christianity has declined over the last 30 years. So that's proven the hypothesis, but it doesn't actually explain the why. Why has this occurred? Why have people stopped, or a large percentage of people stopped identifying themselves as Christian? So this is where you would then engage in qualitative analysis, where you try to answer the question why. Why has this trend occurred? Why have people, or some people, stopped identifying as Christian? And that's kind of trying to understand the meaning behind the phenomenon. Okay, so that's kind of the sociological method. Another aspect of the text, which is an important point, is what Durkheim states here. So Durkheim states, the determination of function is necessary for the complete explanation of the phenomenon. To explain a social fact, it is not enough to show the cause on which it depends. We must also, at least in most cases, show its function in the establishment of social order. So what is he trying to say here? So this is quite an important point. He's making a distinction between two very important aspects, the causes and the function. So for Durkheim, the causes are basically the conditions. The conditions that essentially lead to the outcome of a social fact, right? So the conditions that lead to the outcome of a social fact, while the function relates to the role that basically the social fact plays in creating things like social order, all right? So it's the cause is the conditions, the function is the role that it plays. So let's look at some, say, examples of that to just make it kind of more clear. So what we have here, for example, on the chart above, illustrates that killings or homicide in the UK, this is a little bit old data, but there's basically been an increase, right? So the question then is, okay, why has there been a spike in murders in the UK, especially from 2017 and 18? So the causes would be looking at, in essence, the conditions. So that could be many. That could be things like the socio-economic status, there's poverty. It could be things about, family dynamics. It could be where they're born in terms of inner cities and a lack of resources. So the conditions list those issues. But if you're trying to understand then the function, what does that mean? So, okay, yeah, the causes, what are the causes of a spike in crime? Poverty, lack of education, family dynamics, etc., etc. But what does he mean about the need to apply also function when it comes to, let's say, a spike in crime? What does that mean? So in essence, what he's asserting here is that you need to understand, if you really want to understand crime, you need to also understand its function. So in some ways, crime in society actually has a function. What would that function be? Because not all functions have to be positive or negative, but there is a function for crime, and that is that it reinforces the issue of the rule of law and the sense of justice. So, for example, in society, if we felt that criminals were getting away with their crime, they were getting away with murder, they were getting away with theft, that would create a complete distrust in the system, and society can actually unravel. We need to be reassured that if you commit a crime, the legal system and all these things will basically act and they'll be punished. So there is a function to actually crime, that basically it reinforces amongst us that there is punishment, there is a deterrent, and these things basically stabilize society. So the function of crime and the rule of law is to create social solidarity, to create social cohesion in society. You could say another example would be the other chart, which basically, in a nutshell, looks at inequality in education in the UK. So from this chart, we can see that there is an inequality across the educational spectrum, right? So independent schools, which are private schools, their children and students do much better. Now, what is the cause of this inequality in education? So here we want to look at the conditions, right? The conditions that lead to this inequality. So again, that could be socio-economic, that basically people from the children that go to private schools are usually from a middle class background. Those who go to perhaps state schools are more likely to be from a working class background. That creates a disconnect. So the conditions such as socioeconomics, poverty, family background and dynamics, these are all the conditions. Then Durkheim says to understand the completeness of this social phenomenon, i.e. the inequality of education, you need to also look at the function of education. So the function of education, we probably know, is to not just impart knowledge into the student, but is also to prepare them and indoctrinate them into the norms and the values of society, right? So it's about socialization. So what Durkheim is trying to say by all of this is that it's not enough to understand just the causes, the conditions of a social phenomenon. You need to also understand how it functions in relation to creating things like social order. So this gives you, if you look at causes and function together, it gives you a complete understanding of society and the social phenomenon, if that makes sense. So if you're looking at, say, for example, I don't know, the rise of populist ideology, yeah? In the modern, we've seen a wave of populist nationalist ideology across Europe. You could maybe include Trumpism within that. So why has that occurred? Well, the conditions might be because of things like economic instability. So there might be a decline in unemployment, or a rise, I should say, in unemployment and inflation. That creates economic instability, right? So that fuels uncertainty amongst people. There can be social upheaval, and that can give rise then to populist politics, populist ideology. So again, then you need to then look at, okay, what is the function behind also popularist ideology? Well, it also actually gives a sense of belonging and identity, and it does actually link to cohesion. The last bit that we want to kind of touch upon is the why and the how. So in essence, in some simple way of looking at this, the why is the causes, the conditions, and the how is the function. So the function is how the function basically influences social order. So things like, basically, look, if you're looking at industrial revolution, or the industrial revolution, urbanization, that created all these huge conditional problems. But then how Durkheim looks at it as well is that you have to understand the functionality that comes with it, which is basically a whole idea of social stability that has to be brought about. Okay, looking at social facts in a little bit more detail. So we kind of got an idea of what social facts are. So the way that we want to look at it now is, okay, if you take the individual, we have our individual consciousness, right? So what Durkheim is saying is a social fact is any way of acting, whether fixed or not, capable of exerting over the individual an external constraint, or which is general over the whole of a given society, while having an existence of its own, independent of individual manifestations. Okay. Start again. So the individual has their own individual consciousness, which means your right to choose, right? So I like a certain type of music, I like a certain type of food, I dress a particular way, fashion, right? Now these are my choices. This is a sphere of social, individual consciousness, right? Now that's what might a kind of a psychologist might assert, that these are your individual choices, your individual consciousness creates these things. But for a sociologist, and Durkheim in particular, believes that all of these things are influenced by the social facts, the cultures, the norms, the values, the structures, etc. The social facts influence these things. So what we need to then understand is how. Well, if we take things like music, food, fashion, we have been socialized into a society that has already norms and values established separate from us. So why is it that we know when it's, say, for example, a funeral, that we dress a particular way? Because that's the norm that society has established, that you wear kind of somber colours. Or why is it there is a cultural norm in the UK that if there's a wedding, for women in particular, that they don't wear white because that's the colour that the bride will dress in? Again, that's a kind of norm. So that influences our behaviour. So food, fashion, music, all of these things have been influenced by the cultural norms and values that exist separate from us. So in essence, we are a byproduct of these social facts. So in essence, we might think that we have a free choice, or there's consciousness, complete consciousness, but slowly through processes of socialization, our kind of influence, or these things have started to influence us and constrain us. So, for example, even something like, I don't know, marriage. Marriage, the decision to get married appears to be a choice for two individuals, activating their agency, that basically they've come together and they're basically using their individual consciousness, they've chosen to get married. Now, if you look at the institution of marriage, we can see that culture and norms influence the institution of marriage. So we grow up in a society which says basically the cultural norm is that monogamy is the ideal relationship. So straight away from early childhood we're socialized that monogamy is the ideal relationship. So that influences how we engage in romantic relationships. Also, things like religion and legal systems all influence the whole issue of the institution of marriage. So imagine we've got this idea inserted in our head from the culture and the norms that basically we should have a monogamous relationship, right? So again, that influences how we behave, how we act, how we interact. And that relates to a lot of other factors. So what Durkheim is saying with these social facts is that basically these social facts constrain and influence our behavior. How we think, how we feel, how we act. So these are important aspects. So if you took some examples then, I think examples are always the best way to kind of reinforce what we mean, because there might be vagueness. So, okay, social facts, how they function. Let's take an example of first, let's say the legal example of how social facts at the legal level impose constraints on our behavior. So if we take, for example, the highway code. When I go in my car, straight away, when I sit down, the first thing I do is put on my seatbelt. Now that is basically me following the highway code. If I don't put my seatbelt on and I drive, then basically I could be penalized. What makes me stop at a red light, or what makes me stay within the speed limit, is the highway code. Now the highway code is something separate from me. I did not create the highway code, yet I follow it because it's a social fact. It's something that when I get into my car, it becomes actualized. So I'm going against it if I don't stop at the traffic light, if I don't wear my seatbelt. So this social fact, which is, let's say, for example, here, the highway code, influences me. So it's not my consciousness that chooses to really wear the belt. It's the social fact that I know I'm going to be penalized. There is something called the highway code, and I have to follow it. So in essence, that is influencing my behavior, my actions when I drive. If we think in terms of dress code, we think fashion is clearly something I have consciousness over. But actually, even our choices in fashion are influenced by the norms, by the values of our society. So for example, if you have a job interview tomorrow, most of you will dress in a kind of business fashion, i.e., smart dress, because it's expected, right? That if you have a job interview, you have to demonstrate professionalism, so you might wear a suit. So the social context influences your behavior, your choice of clothing. So no one's going to go to a job interview, say for example, in casual attire, because that's going to be seen as basically going against the social norm, that basically in that scenario you need to dress accordingly, right? So wearing clothes is aligned to cultural norms. So if you have a job interview, you're going to wear a suit. If you're a woman and you grow up in Saudi Arabia, you're going to wear a veil, because the legal or the social facts in that society dictate that women have to wear the veil. So in essence, what happens is that, wearing particular clothes is influenced by the social facts. So in essence, we're kind of aligning ourselves to these norms and values. We're not going against them. we are constrained by them in different contexts in society. So what I'm trying to say is the social facts have a power over the individual. They shape how we think, they shape how we act, they shape how we behave. Are there any questions on that? Cool. Okay, so another thing that we want to kind of look at is this issue of collective conscious that Durkheim talks about. So Durkheim states, the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to the average members of a society forms a system which, with a life of its own. We can call this system the collective or common conscious. It is this collective conscious which gives us the moral framework necessary to live together. It provides a standard against which individual actions can be measured. Okay, so what is Durkheim talking about here? So we said society is composed of individuals and you've got your social facts. The collective consciousness is something that basically we unanimously, collectively agree upon that gives us a kind of moral criteria. So let's say you have social facts like the law, the highway code, and other things. Now, the collective consciousness is something different. The collective consciousness is the complete agreement that we all have as a society, that the criteria for our action. So, for example, what underpins, let's say, when you're talking about the highway code as a collective consciousness, is the idea of the rule of law. So we all in this society uphold this collective concept that there has to be the rule of law, that everyone has to abide by, everyone in there, all the participants of society have to collectively abide by the rule of law. So those laws can be many, many different things, and those laws can influence us in different ways, those social facts. But the collective consciousness is the entire agreement of that, and that gives us this kind of moral criteria and framework. I know I'm not explaining it well, but basically what I'll do, we'll leave it here, and we'll pick up some examples and we'll explain this a little bit better in the Friday lecture. Is there any questions so far? Did everyone sign up to the sign-up sheet? This is probably the last one. So just make sure that you've signed up to that, and that's going to happen, like I said, next week.